The roof of the south barn collapsed on a Tuesday, and Kate Merritt stood in the dust and the splintered timber and felt something inside her chest collapse right along with it. She was 28 years old, and she had been holding the Merritt land together with wire and prayer and sheer stubbornness for 2 years since her father had died, and she was beginning to wonder if stubbornness was finally running out on her. The land was good. The soil along the creek bottom was rich and dark and smelled like promise, and the pastures that rolled out toward the ridge were the kind of green in spring that made a person believe in God without trying very hard. But the house needed a new foundation on the western corner. The well was dropping lower every dry month. The fence line along the northern pasture had been sagged and broken since last winter's ice storm, and now the south barn was nothing more than a pile of old pine boards and bent nails lying in the New Mexico dust. It was the autumn of 1878, and the territory was as unforgiving as it was beautiful. Kate pushed her hat back and looked at the wreckage and thought of her father, Frank Merritt, who had broken this land with his own hands and his own back, and had loved it the way some men love their children, which was deeply and without conditions. He had passed it on to her in his will while her two brothers were off chasing silver in Colorado, and the town of Harlow had found that arrangement quietly scandalous. A woman running a cattle operation alone, without a husband, without a foreman, without anything but herself and her one aging ranch hand, Pete Holloway, who was 63 years old and walked with a limp that got worse every time the weather changed. "Well," Pete said from behind her, looking at the same wreckage, "that is that then." "That is not that," Kate said. "Go check on the cattle and make sure none of them got spooked through the north fence." Pete limped away without arguing, which was one of the things she appreciated about him. Kate stood alone in the morning light and looked at the ruin of the south barn and calculated, as she had been calculating constantly for 2 years, what she had and what she needed. She had 312 head of cattle, which was down from 440 when her father died, because she'd sold off the difference to pay the land taxes and keep the water rights renewed and replace the pump on the east well when it had failed the previous spring. She had enough hay stored in the north barn to get through a moderate winter, but not a hard one. She had $41 in the biscuit tin above the kitchen fireplace, which she'd been saving against emergencies since June. She had the land itself, 320 acres of it, and she had the deed to that land recorded in the Harlow County Clerk's office, and she had no intention of letting it go. What she did not have was enough money to hire a crew and rebuild the south barn before the first hard frost, which would come, in a normal year, sometime in late November. Without the south barn, she could not shelter a third of her herd through the winter. Without a third of her herd, she could not produce enough calves in spring to recover her numbers. Without those numbers, she would not have enough to sell in the fall market to pay next year's land taxes. And the man who held a lien against the southwestern corner of her property, a land speculator from Santa Fe named Harland Voss, had already sent her one letter this spring suggesting she might want to consider selling before her situation became more complicated than she could manage. She had used that letter to start a fire. But the barn was down now, and she was not sure what to use next. It was 3 days after the barn collapsed that Clyde Yates rode up the wagon road to the Merritt property, and Kate was on the roof of the farmhouse at the time, patching a section of the shingles that had been leaking since last spring, and she saw him coming from a half-mile away. He was riding a good bay horse, not showy but solid, and he had a pack mule behind him loaded with what looked, even from a distance, like tools. A carpenter's chest, rolled canvas, rope, a bedroll tied tight. He was not in a hurry. He rode like a man who had been traveling long enough that he no longer had any particular feeling about it one way or the other. She came down off the roof by the time he reached the yard gate, and she stood with the hammer still in her hand and watched him come through. He pulled up a respectful distance from the house and touched the brim of his hat. He was 32 years old. She would learn later, though she put him at around that age just from looking at him. Brown hair showing under the hat, A few days of dark stubble on a square jaw, gray eyes that had a steadiness to them she noticed right away. He was wearing a canvas work coat, and he had calluses on both hands that she could see even before he dismounted. "Ma'am," he said, "I am looking for Kate Merritt. I was told in town she might have work." "Who told you that?" Kate asked. "Fella named Holly's at the feed store. Said there was a ranch out this road that lost a barn and might be needing hands." Holly's prude at the feed store had been her father's friend and had been quietly trying to help her since Frank died, sometimes by sending customers her way and apparently now by sending carpenters. She made a note to thank him and possibly also to have a word with him about sending strangers to her door without warning. "I am Kate Merritt," she said. He dismounted and held the reins loosely in one hand. He did not swagger or posture. He just stood there looking at her with those steady gray eyes like he was prepared to hear whatever she had to say and respond to it honestly. "Clyde Yates," he said. "I do carpentry, framing, general repair. I have done barn raising, housework, fence line, well casing. I am looking for steady work for the season. I do not ask for much in wages if there is a place to sleep and regular meals." Kate looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at the pack mule with its load of tools. Then she looked past him at the wreckage of the south barn, visible beyond the corner of the house, and at the sagging fence line she could see from where she stood, and at the western corner of the house foundation that had been settling visibly since July. "Come look at what I have got," she said. She walked him around the property for the better part of an hour. She showed him the barn wreckage first and watched his face while he walked through it, picking up boards, checking beams, noting what was salvageable and what was not. He was quiet while he worked and she respected that. He was not performing his assessment for her benefit. He was actually assessing. "Most of the upright posts are gone," he said, "but you have got maybe 40% of the board lumber that can be reused if we pull the old nails clean. That saves you a significant amount on material." "I know," Kate said. "I had already started figuring that." He looked at her briefly, not surprised exactly, but recalibrating something. "Good," he said simply. She showed him the fence line next, the broken posts and the rusted wire that had heaved up in the ice and never been properly reset. Then the well, where she lowered a line with a weight and showed him the drop in the water level compared to the marks her father had scratched in the stone casing 10 years ago. Then the western corner of the farmhouse, where you could see with the naked eye that the foundation stones had shifted, and the corner of the house was sitting an inch and a half lower than it should be. "If that corner goes much further," Clyde said, kneeling down and looking at the stonework closely, "you will start to get cracking in the wall above and eventually the roof line will shift." "I know that too," Kate said. He stood up and looked at her again with those gray eyes. "What do you want to start with?" he asked. It was such a direct and practical question, asked without any particular drama, that it cut straight through the knot of anxiety she had been carrying in her chest for the past 3 days. He was not telling her what to do. He was not suggesting she sell. He was not looking at her with that particular combination of pity and condescension she had grown so tired of from the men in Harlow who thought a woman running a cattle operation was a problem waiting to be solved by someone smarter than her. He was asking where she wanted to start. "The barn," she said, "before the weather turns." "That is what I would say too," he said. "You have got maybe 6-7 weeks before it gets serious. We can frame it in 4 if the lumber comes in on schedule and the weather holds. Can you do that with just the 2 of us and Pete? Pete is your ranch hand, the older man I saw near the north pasture. He is 63 and his knee is not reliable," Kate said, "but he is strong when he needs to be and he does not complain." "Then yes," Clyde said, "we can do it." She offered him the bunkhouse that sat behind the main barn, which was a small but decent structure with a cot and a stove. He thanked her without making a ceremony of it. She offered wages of $12 a month, which was what she could manage, and he accepted without trying to negotiate up, which she appreciated more than she showed. He started work the next morning before she had even finished her coffee. She watched him from the kitchen window for a long time, this stranger who had arrived with a mule load of tools and no fuss, and she felt something cautious and complicated beginning to move in her chest. She told herself it was only relief. She had a good carpenter for the season. The barn would get built. The land would be saved. That was all this was. She was not certain she believed herself, but she went out and got to work alongside him, and the question did not come up again for a while. The first week was pure work, and Kate found it steadying in a way she had not expected. She had been alone in her worry for so long that having another competent person beside her in the actual physical labor of the thing was like setting down a weight she had not fully realized she was carrying. They pulled old nails and sorted lumber from the collapse, stacking the salvageable boards in careful rows and burning what was too rotten or twisted to reuse. They measured and marked where the new posts would go, checking the ground for level, which required digging at two corners where the earth had settled unevenly. Clyde worked without wasted motion. He was precise, and he was fast, and he clearly knew what he was doing in a way that was evident not from him saying so, but from watching his hands. He could read a piece of lumber for its weaknesses the way a horse trader reads a horse, running his eyes along the grain and his hands over the surface, and knowing what it was good for and what it was not. He did not talk excessively, which she appreciated, because she had spent 2 years having conversations with people who talked at her and never actually heard what she said back. But he did talk when there was something worth saying. On the third day, while they were digging the post holes for the south wall, he said, without looking up from his work, "You are managing this place by yourself." "Pete helps," she said. "I mean, you are the one running it, making the decisions." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment, working the post hole digger down through the hard clay soil. "That is a serious operation for one person," he said. "Not a criticism, an observation." "I know it," Kate said. "My father built it up over 30 years. I'm not going to let 30 years of work fall apart because he is gone." Clyde looked up at her then. "How long has he been gone?" 2 years this past March. "And your brothers? In Colorado, they wrote me twice in 2 years. One letter to say they were sorry about father, one letter to ask if I needed them to come help sell the land." Something shifted in his jaw, not anger exactly, but a tightening. "And you wrote back?" "I wrote back that I did not need their help selling anything." He made a sound that might have been a laugh if he had let it go further. "Good," he said, and went back to digging. She found herself smiling at her post hole long after that, and not entirely sure why. By the end of the first week, they had the post holes dug, and the corner posts set in concrete that Clyde had mixed himself from a bag of Portland cement he had brought on the mule. Pete, who had been quietly skeptical of this stranger from the first moment, came around on the fourth day when he watched Clyde mortise a joint with a precision that Pete, who had done carpentry himself in his younger years, recognized as the work of someone properly trained. "Where did you learn your trade?" Pete asked him that evening when the three of them were eating the supper Kate had cooked at the long table in the farmhouse kitchen. "My father was a carpenter in Missouri," Clyde said. "I learned from him from the time I could hold a saw, then I worked my way west doing it, Kansas, then the territory." "You have family back in Missouri?" "My mother and one sister. My father passed 6 years ago." "What brought you west?" Clyde considered this for a moment. "I was looking for something," he said, and left it there. Kate did not press him, though she was curious. She had learned in 2 years of running this place that a direct answer was not always more honest than a partial one, and sometimes what a person chose not to say told you more about their character than what they chose to say. She thought about it later, lying in her father's old bed, which she had taken over because it was larger and the farmhouse bedroom faced east and got the morning light. What was he looking for? He did not seem like a restless man, not in the way that some men in the territory were restless, always looking for the next thing, the next strike, the next horizon. He seemed like a man who had arrived somewhere and was looking to see if it was the right place. She told herself that was none of her business and went to sleep. The second week, the framing went up, and there was something almost joyful about it. The way the structure rose out of the New Mexico ground and cast its first shadows again. Clyde had a way of explaining each step as they worked that was neither condescending nor overly technical, just clear and direct, like he assumed she could understand anything he told her if he explained it well. She found herself learning things she had not known about the mechanics of a structure, how the weight distributed, why a cross brace went where it did, what made the difference between a barn that would last 20 years and one that would last 50. "You do not just build for now," he said one afternoon, squinting up at the ridge beam they had just wrestled into place. "You build for the next person who has to depend on this." "My father used to say something like that," Kate said. "He would say, build it for whoever comes after you." He looked at her from the other end of the ridge beam, and there was something in his face just then that was not about the barn at all. But it passed quickly, and he was back to being the carpenter, checking the beam for level with his long spirit level, making small adjustments. "He sounds like a man who knew what he was doing," Clyde said. "He did," Kate said, and her voice was steady. She had done most of her crying for her father in private at odd hours, and she had made her peace with it in the way you make peace with the things you cannot change, not by forgetting but by carrying it differently. The barn went up on schedule, and it was a good barn. Kate stood back and looked at it on the afternoon they finished the roof, and she felt something open in her chest that had been closed for a long time. It was not fixed. Nothing was fully fixed, but this one thing was better than it had been, and it stood solid and real in the afternoon light, and it was proof that things could be repaired. "Well," Pete said, standing beside her, "I will admit I had my doubts." "You had many doubts," Kate said. "I had many doubts," Pete agreed comfortably. "I was wrong about most of them." She looked at Clyde, who was standing on the far side of the yard cleaning the sawdust and shavings off his tools with careful hands. He was not looking at her. He was looking at the barn with the quiet satisfaction of a man who has made a thing and knows it is a good thing. "Thank you," she said, loud enough for him to hear. He looked over at her. "We have still got the fence line and the foundation corner and the well to look at," he said. "Do not thank me until it is all done." "I can thank you for the barn while still acknowledging the rest of the work," she said. The corner of his mouth moved. It was not quite a smile, but it was in the neighborhood of one. "Fair enough," he said. She did not analyze the way her pulse was behaving during this exchange. She simply noted it, filed it somewhere private, and went to start supper. The trouble with Harland Voss arrived the following week, which was perhaps inevitable because trouble had a way of arriving in the middle of things that were otherwise going well, as if it was drawn by the scent of hope. Voss himself did not come. He sent a man named Garrett, who rode up on a Thursday morning when Kate was in the kitchen going over her account ledger and Clyde and Pete were out working on the fence line in the north pasture. Garrett was a lean, cold-eyed man in a clean coat who looked like someone who had been hired specifically for the purpose of delivering bad news in a way that made it sound like good news. He knocked on the door, and when Kate opened it, he handed her a letter, and he waited while she read it. The letter was from Voss's attorney in Santa Fe, and it said, in the careful language of lawyers, that the lien against the southwestern corner of the Merritt property had been purchased from the original creditor by Harland Voss 18 months ago, and that Voss was now prepared to exercise his legal options regarding the outstanding balance, which was $312, within 60 days. $312 was more than 7 times the money in the biscuit tin. Kate folded the letter with hands that she would not allow to shake. "Tell Mr. Voss that I received his letter," she said. "He wondered if you might have a message in return," Garrett said. "I do not have a message," Kate said. "I have a receipt." She went into the kitchen, found the receipts ledger her father had kept, and produced the record of the original debt and the interest payments that had been made against it over the years. The outstanding balance was not $312. If the payments were properly credited, it was considerably less. But she also knew that Voss's attorney had presumably done his arithmetic carefully, and the original terms of the lien were not entirely clear on how the interest compounded. After Garrett left, she stood in the kitchen with the letter and the ledger and felt the ground shifting under her feet in a way that had nothing to do with the settling foundation. She was out at the north fence line within 20 minutes. Clyde was resetting a post when she came through the gate, and he looked at her face and knew before she said anything that something had changed. "Tell me," he said, straightforward as always. She told him. She showed him the letter, and she showed him the ledger, and she explained the situation with the lien as clearly as she could, and he listened without interrupting and without the particular expression of resigned helplessness that she had gotten from the men in Harlow whenever she explained her financial situation. He listened like he was taking in information and preparing to be useful with it. Who would know the exact terms of the original lien? He asked when she finished. The county clerk's office would have the recorded document, she said. My father's attorney in Harlow, Mr. Calhoun, would have the original papers. Then that is where you need to go, he said. Before you respond to Voss in any way, you need to know exactly what the lien says. If his number is wrong, you have legal ground to stand on. If his number is right, then you know what you are actually dealing with. I know that, Kate said, slightly sharp because she was frightened, and it came out as sharpness, which she immediately regretted. He did not flinch. You know that, he said evenly. I am just thinking out loud alongside you, she exhaled. I am sorry, she said. You do not need to be sorry, he said. This is a serious situation, and you are entitled to be angry about it. She looked at him across the half-reset fence post with the New Mexico sky spread out behind him and the wind moving through the brown grass of the late October pasture, and she felt something she had not felt in a very long time, which was the sense that she was not entirely alone in this. Not just that Pete was there, loyal and steady as Pete was, but that there was someone standing alongside her who was actually in it with her, thinking about it, caring about the outcome. It was a dangerous feeling to have about a man who had been here less than 3 weeks. She took herself into Harlow the next morning. Harlow was a proper town by 1878 standards, with a main street wide enough for 2 wagons to pass, a general store, a bank, a hotel, a saloon, a livery, a doctor's office, a church, and the offices of various lawyers and land agents that had multiplied in the territory as the homesteading rushed along. Kate had grown up riding into Harlow with her father, and she knew most of the people in it, and most of them knew her, and the relationships were various. Some people admired what she was doing with the Merritt land. Some people were simply waiting for her to fail because they had decided in advance that she would. Mr. Calhoun, her father's attorney, was a thin, careful man of about 50 who kept meticulous records and who had always treated Kate with more respect than most. He produced the original lien document within 10 minutes of her arrival. The news was not entirely good and not entirely bad. The outstanding balance, properly calculated with the payments credited against the principal rather than only the interest, was $219. That was less than Voss was claiming by nearly $100, which gave her ground to push back on the inflated figure. But $219 was still an amount she did not have. What are my options? She asked Mr. Calhoun. You could contest the amount and buy yourself time through the courts, he said. That could mean 6 months, possibly more, before Voss could act on the lien, but it costs money to litigate, and his attorney is experienced. And if I cannot pay in 60 days, he can force a sale of the southwestern corner to satisfy the debt. That is approximately 40 acres. It is the corner that includes your Western Creek access. The Western Creek access was where her cattle watered in late summer when the other sources dropped. Without it, she would be in serious trouble in any dry year, and dry years in New Mexico were not rare. She rode home slowly, thinking. She told Clyde and Pete that evening at supper. She laid it out plainly because she had learned that the thing you did not say out loud had a way of growing larger in the dark. $219, Pete said, and his voice carried the weight of a man calculating possibilities and not finding enough of them. Or I fight it in court and buy time, Kate said. Can you raise the money in 60 days some other way? Clyde asked. I have $41 saved. I could sell cattle, but the fall market in Harlow is not good right now. Beef prices are down because of the drives coming up from Texas. I would be selling low. How many head would you need to sell to make $219 at current prices? She had already done this math. At what they are paying in Harlow right now, I would need to sell close to 30 head. And you can afford to lose 30 head without jeopardizing your spring calving numbers. Not really, she said. Not without cutting into my breeding stock. Clyde sat quietly for a moment. He had his coffee cup between both hands and he was looking at the table, not at her. In the particular way he looked at things when he was thinking hard about them. There is a cattle buyer in Las Vegas, he said, meaning the town of Las Vegas, New Mexico, which was the rail terminus and a much larger market than Harlow. I passed through there 2 months ago. They were paying better prices because they are buying for the rail shipments east. If you could drive 20 head to Las Vegas instead of selling in Harlow, you might make the difference. Kate looked at him. Las Vegas is 4 days' drive from here. Yes, he said. I cannot leave the property for 4 days. And Pete cannot. She glanced at Pete, who was looking at the table in the way he looked at things when he was embarrassed about his knee. I can manage the property, Pete said, with the slightly belligerent dignity of a man who was tired of being discussed as a limitation. 4 days is 4 days. I would go with you, Clyde said. He said it straightforwardly, like it was simply the next logical step in the problem solving. 2 people driving 20 head to Las Vegas is manageable. She looked at him for a long moment. There were layers to this conversation that she was acutely aware of, things that were not quite being said but that were present in the room nonetheless. The awareness between them had been building quietly for 3 weeks, like a fire that had not yet been named but was putting out heat nonetheless. You would be doing that on top of the work here, she said. That is a lot to ask. You did not ask, he said. I offered. She looked at Pete, who was looking at his coffee with a small smile that he was not bothering to hide very well. For days, she said. Maybe 5, Clyde said, depending on the pace. 4 days, she said firmly. I will not leave Pete with a lame knee and a full operation for 5 days. I will walk fine, Pete said, which was not strictly true but which she let stand because she could see he needed to say it. They left 2 days later in the early morning, before the sun was up, with 20 of her best steers that she could afford to part with and still maintain her spring numbers. It was cold at 4 in the morning in October in New Mexico, the kind of cold that had not yet decided whether it was going to be serious, and their breath came out in small clouds as they cut the cattle out of the herd and started them south toward the Las Vegas road. The first day of the drive was work, pure and uncomplicated. Keeping 20 head moving in a consistent direction required constant attention, and there was not much room for conversation above the normal business of the cattle and the horses. Kate had been on cattle drives before, though always as a younger person helping her father, and she found that the skills came back to her naturally. She knew how to read the mood of a moving herd, knew how to cut off a steer that was thinking about drifting without disturbing the others, knew when to let them slow and when to push. Clyde watched her work for the first few hours and then stopped watching, in the sense that he stopped monitoring and started simply working alongside her, trusting her competence the way she trusted his. It was a good feeling, working with someone who trusted your competence. They camped that first night by the side of the road, where a shallow creek made a good water stop for the cattle, and they made a fire and ate the food Kate had packed and drank coffee from the tin pot she had brought and watched the cattle settle into their night grazing. The sky in New Mexico at night in October was something that could make a person feel very small and very alive at the same time. All those stars burning hard and clear in the cold air, the Milky Way spread out like a road made of light. I have not done this in a long time, Kate said, looking up at the sky. A cattle drive. No, just sitting, not doing the next thing. She paused, feeling the sky. He was sitting across the fire from her, and in the firelight his face had that quality it sometimes had when he thought she was not watching him, which was open in a way it was not quite open otherwise. There was something in him that was watching her, not the way a man watches a woman he wants something from, but the way a person watches someone they are finding surprising. "You work too hard," he said. "The work is what it is," she said. "That is not what I mean," he said. "I mean you carry too much of it. You do not let yourself," he searched for the word, "put it down, even for an hour." "If I put it down it does not get done," she said. "Tonight it is getting done fine with the fire and the coffee," he said. She looked at him over the flames. "You have been watching me pretty closely for a carpenter," she said, and her voice was lighter than she expected it to be, almost teasing, which surprised her. He did not look away. "Yes," he said simply, without apology or performance. "Just yes." The word sat between them in the firelight and the cold, and the sound of the cattle moving and the enormous night sky, and Kate felt the thing she had been not naming for 3 weeks press up against the edges of where she kept it and ask to be let out. She did not let it out. Not yet. But she stopped pretending it was not there. "Tell me about Missouri," she said instead. He talked then, and she listened, and she learned things she had not known. He had grown up in a small town on the Missouri River, the son of a man who built houses and churches and who had taught his son that a structure well made was a kind of prayer. His mother was still there, a small fierce woman of 60 who grew vegetables and kept chickens, and wrote him letters in a handwriting so small he had to hold the paper up to the window to read it. His sister had married a farmer and had 3 children, and Clyde was their favorite uncle because he built them things, toys and furniture, and a dollhouse that had taken him the better part of a winter. He had come west after his father died because he had felt, in the grief and the restlessness that followed, that he needed to be somewhere his father had never been, needed to find a version of himself that was not only the son of the man who taught him. He had worked Kansas for 2 years and then drifted into the territory and worked his way from job to job, building things for people who needed them built. He was good at the work and the work was good to him, but he had not until recently, he said, and then stopped. "Until recently what?" Kate asked. He looked at the fire. "Until recently felt like I might have found a place that was the right kind of place," he said. She let that sit. She did not push it further that night. They put the fire out and she rolled into her bedroll on one side of the camp, and he rolled into his on the other, with the cold New Mexico night between them and 20 steers making their slow night sounds in the creek brush. And she lay awake for a long time looking at the stars and not pretending, in the privacy of her own mind, that she did not know what he had meant. The second day's drive went smoothly, and the third brought them down onto the flatter road east of the Sangre de Cristo foothills, where Las Vegas opened up ahead of them, the smoke of the town rising in the clear air and the distant sound of the rail yard carrying on the wind. The cattle buyer at the Las Vegas yards was a broad man named Tanner who wore a good hat and chewed constantly and looked at cattle with the unsentimental expertise of someone who had been buying and selling them all his life. He walked the 20 steers with the slow deliberateness of his trade, checking their condition, their weight, their general health, and then he turned to Kate and named a price. It was better than Harlow, not by an enormous amount but enough. She negotiated. She had watched her father negotiate cattle prices since she was 10 years old, and she knew how it was done, which was not by arguing loudly, but by standing still and knowing your number and waiting with a patience that most people found uncomfortable. Tanner raised his price twice and then held, and the final price was enough, combined with what she had in the biscuit tin, to pay the lien and have something left over. She walked out of the cattle yard with the money in a leather pouch inside her coat and stood in the bright cold afternoon sun of Las Vegas, New Mexico, and felt something loosen in her chest that had been wound tight for 60 days at least, possibly much longer. Clyde was waiting with the horses. He looked at her face and said, "Enough." "Enough," she said. He nodded. There was satisfaction in his face and something else, something warmer, and he looked away at the street before she could read it fully. "Then we should head back," he said. "We should," she said. "But first I am buying supper at the hotel. A real supper with a table and chairs and food I did not cook over a campfire." He smiled then, a full smile, and she felt it in her ribcage. "I would not argue with that," he said. The hotel in Las Vegas had a dining room with white tablecloths and candles, and a kitchen that could produce a proper meal. And they sat across from each other in the warm yellow light of it and ate beef and potatoes and fresh bread and drank coffee that was better than anything they could make on the trail, and they talked for 2 hours. Not about the ranch or the money or the work, or not mostly about those things, but about everything else. Books, which she was surprised to find he had read widely, having carried them in the pack with his tools from job to job. Music, which he said he had no talent for whatsoever but loved to hear, and she said she could play the piano that stood in the corner of the farmhouse parlor, which had been her mother's, who had died when Kate was 12. Her father had kept the piano tuned out of love for his wife's memory, and Kate had learned to play it out of the same love. Clyde said he would like to hear that someday. There was something in that someday that meant more than a polite expression. "You said you were looking for something," Kate said at one point over the coffee. "Back on the first night on the trail, you started to say you had found a place that felt like the right kind of place." He looked at her across the white tablecloth and the candle. He had cleaned up at the hotel washroom, and he had the look of a man who was not trying to be anything other than what he was, which was, she had decided over the past 3 weeks, a very good kind of man to be around. "I said until recently," he said. "I did not say I had found a place. I said I felt like I might be finding one." "Is there a difference?" "Yes," he said. "One is settled, the other is still becoming." She looked at him for a long moment. The candle was between them, and the dining room around them was full of the quiet noise of other people having their own conversations and their own evenings, and she was acutely aware that this conversation was one of those ones that a person remembers for the rest of their life. "Tell me what you mean, Clyde," she said quietly. He was quiet for a moment, and she could see him deciding. He was not a man who spoke carelessly or quickly about important things, but he was also not a man who hid from them. "I mean," he said, "that I have been on your property for 3 weeks and worked alongside you and watched you fight for something that most people would have let go of by now, and I think you are the most," he paused, choosing carefully, "the most genuinely capable and honest and strong person I have met in a long time, and I am aware that this is not an appropriate conversation to have with an employer." "I am aware of that too," Kate said. "Tell me anyway." His gray eyes were very steady. "I think about you in a way that I should probably be more careful about," he said. "I have been aware of that for a while, and I have not said anything because you have enough to manage without me adding to it." "What if I told you," Kate said, and her heart was doing something ridiculous, "that it is not adding to what I am managing?" He was very still for a moment. "Then I would say that I am glad to hear it," he said, "and I would ask if I might be allowed to say so more plainly at some point." "At some point," she said. "Not tonight. Tonight I just needed to know." He nodded, slow and serious, and there was a warmth in his face that was so genuine it made her look down at her coffee cup for a moment, because it was almost more than she could hold. They rode back to the ranch in 3 days, a faster pace without the cattle, and the ride had a quality to it that was different from the ride out. Not different in anything visible or dramatic, but different in the way that two people who have acknowledged something move differently around each other, the space between them charged with a quiet understanding that had not been there before. She paid Mr. Calhoun a visit 2 days after getting back, and Mr. Calhoun wrote a letter to Voss's attorney presenting the correct calculation of the outstanding balance, and enclosing a bank draft for $219 drawn against the funds from the cattle sale. The letter was precise and final and left no room for further negotiation. Mr. Calhoun handed her the copy with a small, satisfied expression. "That should end it," he said. It did end it. Voss's attorney responded 2 weeks later with a terse acknowledgement of the payment and a release of the lien, and Kate stood in Mr. Calhoun's office and held the release document and felt the last of the fear she had been carrying about the southwestern corner finally let go. The Western Creek access was hers. The land was hers. She walked out of Mr. Calhoun's office onto the main street of Harlow and stood in the November sun and breathed. Work continued at the ranch through November. The fence line came next, the most physically demanding of the remaining tasks, miles of post resetting and wire restringing along the northern and western boundaries of the property. It was cold work in November, the ground hard and the wind cutting down from the mountains, but they worked through it steadily, day by day, section by section, and the fence line that had been sagged and broken emerged straight and tight and properly tensioned. Kate worked alongside Clyde for most of it, and Pete took the sections that did not require the heavy post setting. They talked while they worked, the way people talk when they are engaged in physical labor together, in the comfortable rhythm of back and forth that does not require the social effort of sitting across a table. They talked about the land and what she wanted to do with it in the long run, how she was thinking about expanding the herd back toward 400 head over the next 3 years, about whether the southern pasture might carry more cattle if she put in a water line from the creek, about the apple trees in the kitchen garden that her mother had planted and that Kate had been trying to keep productive. They talked about his work, the things he had built across Kansas and the territory, the house in Abilene he was most proud of, a farmhouse for a family of 6 that he had built from the ground up over 4 months, every joint tight, every corner square. And they talked about other things. About the territory itself, which was in a complicated state in 1878, the Lincoln County War having wound down only recently after years of violence between competing cattle interests, the land and law questions still unsettled, the Apache conflicts in the South still very much alive. The Mescalero having been pushed onto the reservation at Chilarosa, but the conditions there difficult and the history of those pressures as unjust as anything Kate had watched happen in her own experience with the land. She said as much. "My father used to say," she said one afternoon, restringing wire while Clyde held the post, that the way the government handled the Apache land was going to be the measure of what we actually were as a people, and that we were not measuring up. He was right, Clyde said, without any particular display, just as a statement of fact. I have been through country in the Southern Territory where you can see what was taken and who it was taken from, and the reasoning they gave for it was not different in kind from the reasoning that Voss was using on you, just bigger in scale and backed by federal law instead of a lawyer in Santa Fe. She looked at him. It was not the kind of conversation that most men in Harlow would have had, at least not in that way with that directness. "You have thought about this," she said. "Hard not to," he said, "if you are paying attention." She thought about that for a long time while they worked, and it added itself to the list of things she was accumulating about him, the list that she kept in the private part of her mind where she was honest with herself. The week before Thanksgiving, they tackled the foundation corner. This was the most technically demanding of the remaining jobs, requiring a careful approach to lifting the settled corner of the house without disturbing the rest of the structure. Clyde rigged a jack system using a heavy timber and an iron screw jack he had in his tool chest, and he explained each step carefully before doing it. They worked slowly and precisely, with Pete in the house watching for any cracking in the walls and calling out, and Kate and Clyde outside with the jack and the replacement stones. It took 2 full days. But when they were done, the corner was level again and the new stones were set solid in a bed of mortar, and Clyde went inside and measured the wall in 3 places and found it true. "It will hold," he said. "Better than it was before because the original stones were not well dressed. These ones are." Kate ran her hand along the repaired corner, feeling the solid, cold stone under her palm. The house felt different, more settled, more permanent. "Thank you," she said, and she meant it for all of it, not just the foundation, but for the barn and the fence and the lien and the drive to Las Vegas and the evenings at the supper table and the conversations about the sky. He was very close to her, standing at the corner of the house, both of them looking at the repaired foundation. She could feel the warmth of him in the cold November air. "Kate," he said. She turned and looked at him. He was looking at her with those gray eyes, and the decision was in his face, the one she had seen forming since Las Vegas. "I told you in Las Vegas I might want to say something more plainly at some point," he said. "I remember." "Is this a reasonable time?" She almost smiled. He was being so careful, so respectful, and it moved her the way his steadiness always moved her. "Yes," she said, "this is a reasonable time." He took a breath. "I am not a man with a great deal to offer," he said. "I have my tools and my trade and a bedroll and a mule. I do not have land of my own or money in a bank. What I have is the willingness to work hard and the intention to be honest, and the fact that I have not spent a day on this property without thinking that I would very much like to keep being here. Not because the work is good, though it is, because you are here." Kate looked at him, and the November sky was very blue above them, and the repaired barn stood solid in the yard, and the fence lines ran straight to the horizon, and the house behind her was solid at its corners. "I am here," she said. "I intend to keep being here for the rest of my life." "I know that," he said. "That is one of the things." He paused, and something moved in his face that was tender in a way she had not seen on him before. "One of the things I find most remarkable about you. You know what you are and where you belong, and you hold to it. I admire that more than I have words for." "Clyde," she said, and her voice was quieter now. "Yes, stop talking and say the thing." He looked at her for one more moment, steady and warm and sure. "I love you," he said. "I am aware that 3 months is too soon to say that, and I am saying it anyway because it is true. And I would rather say true things too early than careful things at the right time." The wind moved through the yard, and the cattle were moving in the north pasture, and Pete was presumably still inside measuring walls. And Kate Merritt stood at the corner of her repaired farmhouse and felt something settle into place inside her that had been unsettled for a very long time. "I love you too," she said. "I have been trying not to for at least 6 weeks." He laughed then, a real laugh, surprised and genuine, and she had not heard him laugh quite like that before, and she loved it immediately. "Why were you trying not to?" he asked. "Because I did not know what you wanted," she said. "I did not know if you were going to take the money from the next job somewhere and move on. I did not know if you were looking for somewhere to stop or somewhere to pass through." He reached out and touched her face with one hand, careful and deliberate, his calloused thumb just at her cheekbone. "I told you in Las Vegas," he said quietly. "I am still becoming. I would like to become here if you would have me." She put her hand over his, holding it against her face. "I would have you," she said. "I would very much have you." He kissed her then, or she kissed him. The cold November air around them, and the smell of mortar and fresh pine from the new barn nearby, and the land stretching out in every direction. And it was a good first kiss in the way that good first kisses are. The kind that feel like something coming home rather than something starting. Pete, who appeared at the front door at this moment to report on the wall measurements, saw what was happening, made no sound whatsoever, and went back inside with the careful tread of a man preserving his dignity. November softened into December, and December came in cold and clean, with frost on the ground every morning and the first real snow falling the week before Christmas. 2 inches of white that lay over the pastures like something new, and covered the tracks of everything that had been difficult and made the land look, for a day, like it was beginning again. Kate and Clyde were by this point in a courtship that was open and public enough that Harlow had noticed it, which meant it had been discussed at length at the feed store and the general store, and after Sunday services at the little Methodist church. Kate attended not entirely out of conviction, but out of loyalty to her father's habits. The opinion of Harlow was mixed in the particular way that small frontier towns are always mixed about things that are happening to a woman doing something unusual. Some people thought it was a fine thing. Martha Holly's Pruitt's wife, had told Kate straight out that she was glad she had sent Clyde her way, and that he seemed like exactly the right kind of man, by which she meant hardworking and kind and not a fool. The Reverend Caldwell had shaken Clyde's hand after church one Sunday with an expression of genuine approval. Old Joe Duffy at the livery had told Pete that the Merritt girl had good taste. Others were less enthusiastic. There were women in town who had expected Kate to eventually give up the ranch and marry some established man in the area and settle into a proper domestic arrangement. And the fact that she seemed to be doing neither, that she was keeping the ranch and finding her own man and making it work on her own terms, was dissonant to them in ways they expressed as concern for her well-being. Kate paid attention to the people who were happy for her and less attention to the others, which was the same policy she had applied for 2 years and which had served her fairly well. Clyde had quietly integrated himself into the life of the ranch in a way that felt natural rather than deliberate. He was not trying to take over the operation. He was not positioning himself as the authority. He asked before he made decisions that were not strictly within the scope of carpentry, and he deferred to Kate on matters of the cattle and the land because those were her domain and he knew it and respected it. But he was there, fully and genuinely there, and the ranch ran better for it. The south barn was solid. The fences were right. The foundation was sound. The well, which he had worked on in late November, had a new casing that would hold better through the freeze, and a pump mechanism he had replaced with an improved one. The things she had been trying to hold together with wire and prayer were actually held together now, properly, by hands that knew what they were doing. At Christmas, she played the piano for the first time in 2 years. She had not played it since her father died, had walked past it every day and not sat down at it, because it was too much of him and too much of her mother, and she had not had the heart for it. But on Christmas Eve, with the fire going in the parlor and the snow outside and Pete dozing in the chair by the hearth and Clyde sitting on the settee watching her with his quiet gray eyes, she sat down and put her hands on the keys and played. She played hymns first because they were easiest, the fingers remembering what the mind had to search for. Then she played a waltz her mother had loved, a bright and rolling thing that filled the small parlor and seemed to make the room larger. Then she played something of her own, a slow and searching thing without a name that she had composed years ago on an evening very much like this one, and which expressed something about the land and the open sky and the particular feeling of being exactly where you belonged. When she finished, the room was quiet except for the fire. Pete was awake. He was looking at the fire with his coffee cup, and his eyes were bright in a way that she understood. Clyde was looking at her. He had the look on his face that he sometimes got when he was feeling something fully and had not yet found the words for it. He found them a moment later. "Your mother taught you that," he said. "The technique," Kate said. "That last one I wrote myself, a long time ago." "It is beautiful," he said, and then more quietly, "You are beautiful." Pete suddenly became very absorbed in his coffee. Kate did not look away from Clyde. "Thank you," she said, and her voice was soft. He proposed on a February evening in 1879, and he did it in the kitchen, which was not particularly romantic as a setting, but which was entirely appropriate because the kitchen was where she was most herself, standing at the stove in the lamplight with the smell of cooking food and the sound of the wind outside, and the solid, ordinary reality of the life she had chosen. He had been planning it, she realized afterward. The timing was deliberate. He had waited until the winter work was well in hand, until the hardest months were past, until she could stand in her own kitchen and feel the solidity of everything that had been repaired and reinforced. He wanted her to be choosing him from a place of security, not need. "Kate," he said from the table behind her, and she turned. He was standing, which she noticed, and he had something in his hand, which was a ring that had belonged to his mother, who had sent it to him in a letter 3 weeks ago at his request, a small gold band with a single turquoise stone that was not worth a great deal, but which was the most personal thing she had ever been offered. "I want to ask you something," he said. She turned fully from the stove, dish towel still in her hand, and looked at him. "I know this land is yours," he said. "I know this life is yours and you built it and you intend to keep building it. I'm not asking you to give any of that up or change any of that. I'm asking if you would let me be part of it, not just for the season, not just for the work, permanently. As your husband, if you will have me in that way. The wind outside, the fire inside, the ring in his hand with the turquoise stone catching the lamplight. His face, those gray eyes, the steadiness she had come to love like a necessary thing. Clyde Yates, she said, I have been holding this land together for 2 years by myself, and I intend to hold it together for the rest of my life whether you marry me or not. But I would very much like it if you were here when I did it. Is that a yes? He said, and there was a warmth in his voice that was almost laughter. That is the most unreserved yes I know how to give, she said. He crossed the kitchen and put the ring on her finger, and then he kissed her, properly and thoroughly. In the lamplight of the kitchen she had cooked in since she was 12 years old, and she put her hands against his chest, and felt his heart beating under her palms, and thought that this was what it felt like to have a full life. Pete found out the next morning. He was in the kitchen when Kate came down, and he looked at her hand, which was not particularly subtle of her, and he got a look on his face that was old and knowing and happy. Well, he said, it is about time. It has been 6 months, Kate said. I said what I said, Pete replied and poured her coffee. They were married in May at the small Methodist church in Harlow, with Reverend Caldwell officiating and Pete standing up for the groom in the absence of Clyde's family, who could not make the journey from Missouri, and Martha Holly standing with Kate, because Kate's friends were few but the ones she had were genuine. Holly's prude gave her away, which she had asked him to do because he had loved her father and her father would have wanted someone to do it. The wedding was a modest affair because Kate was a practical woman and did not believe in spending money on ceremony that could be better spent on cattle. There was a gathering at the church hall afterward with food that the women of Harlow had contributed, because, whatever the mixed feelings about Kate Merritt running her ranch alone, the women of Harlow knew how to rally for a wedding, and there was music from a fiddle player named Tors who had been making people dance at events in Harlow for 15 years. Clyde danced, which she had not known he could do. He was not graceful exactly, but he was rhythmic and sure-footed, which she supposed she should have expected from a man who was rhythmic and sure-footed at everything else. And when he took her hand for the first dance and they moved together in the warm, crowded hall with the fiddle playing and the people of Harlow watching, she felt completely and perfectly happy. She could not remember the last time she had felt completely and perfectly happy. It had been before her father died, certainly. Maybe before her mother died. It was a feeling that had been gone for a long time, and now it was back, not as the uncomplicated happiness of childhood, but as the deeper, earned happiness of a person who has fought for something and received something and knows the difference between luck and grace and is grateful for both. Summer came, and the ranch ran better than it had since before her father's illness. The south barn was solid and dry, and the cattle filled it easily. The north pasture was green from a good spring rain, and the fence lines held, and the western creek ran full and cool, and the herd watered at it without any question of access. The foundation of the house was level, and the roof did not leak, and the well produced clean, cold water without complaint. Clyde expanded his work. He was not exclusively a ranch carpenter now, though he continued to maintain the property. He had taken on some work in Harlow and the surrounding area, building and repairing for neighbors and townspeople, which brought in additional income that they pooled together. He was well regarded quickly because his work was good, and because he was honest, and because he did not overcharge people who did not have much money, which was most people in the territory in 1878 and 1879. He had built a small workshop behind the south barn where he did finer work in the evenings, cabinet pieces and furniture, and occasionally something purely for pleasure. And the things he made had the quality of things made by someone who understood that objects could carry meaning. He made Kate a chair for the parlor that autumn, a rocking chair in white oak with arms curved to fit a person sitting comfortably in them, with a slight lean to the back that was exactly right. He brought it into the parlor one evening and set it beside the fireplace without ceremony. She sat in it and it was perfect. "How did you know?" she asked. "Watched you sit in chairs," he said. Watched where you settled and where you did not. She looked up at him. You have been watching me sitting in chairs. Among other things, he said, and there was a lightness in him that she loved, the way his humor came out quiet and dry and genuine, nothing performed. She reached out and took his hand. He sat on the arm of the old settee nearby and held her hand, and they were quiet together in the firelight, and it was the kind of quiet that is very full. She was pregnant by autumn, which she discovered in September and told Clyde one evening after supper in the kitchen, sitting across the table from him with the lamp between them. He was quiet for a moment, and then he got up and came around the table and knelt beside her chair and took her hands in both of his, and his face had the look of a man receiving news of something he has hoped for without letting himself hope too loudly. "How are you feeling?" he asked, which was the first thing he said, and she loved him for it. "Well," she said, "a little sick in the mornings, but otherwise well." "You will tell me if that changes," he said. "I will tell you," she said, "but I am not fragile." "I know you are not fragile," he said. "I am asking because I want to know, not because I think you cannot handle it." "I know," she said, and put her free hand on his face. Pete's reaction the next morning was to declare that he had been expecting this for months, which was almost certainly not true, but which she let pass, and then to say he hoped it was a boy, and then to immediately correct himself and say that a girl would be perfectly fine, and that he would love whichever it was, which was so Pete that she laughed until her eyes watered. The winter of 1879 going into 1880 was a hard one, with snow in December that came heavy and stayed, and temperatures that dropped low enough to crack the water in the troughs and require breaking ice every morning before the cattle could drink. They had put up enough hay in the north barn to carry the full herd through, and they used it steadily, and the south barn was warm and dry, and held its share of the animals without complaint, and she thought every cold morning as she walked out across the snow-covered yard how differently this winter would have gone without that barn standing solid and properly built. Clyde wrapped her in every layer she owned when she went out in the cold and stopped short of trying to keep her in the house, because he knew better, but she could see him watching from the kitchen window sometimes, tracking her across the yard, and she found it more endearing than annoying, which was saying something because she had a low tolerance for being fussed over. Their son was born in June of 1880 at the farmhouse, with the midwife from Harlow in attendance and Clyde in the next room so present and so loud in his worry that the midwife, a pragmatic woman named Mrs. Flores, finally opened the door and told him that everything was proceeding normally and that he should stop wearing a hole in the floor. They named him Frank, for her father. Frank Yates came into the world in the summer heat of a New Mexico morning, with the energy and volume of a person who intended to make himself clearly known, and Clyde held him in the kitchen afterward with the look of a man who has been completely undone by a small person and does not mind at all. "Hello," he said to the baby, very quietly, in the direct way he said things that mattered. The baby looked at him with unfocused new eyes. "I built your grandfather's barn," Clyde told him. "I intend to build you a great many things." Kate, lying in the bed and feeling the particular exhausted happiness of a woman who has just done the hardest work of her life, watched her husband talk to their son in the doorway and felt the fullness of her life as a physical thing in her chest. Pete came in that afternoon and looked at the baby with his old ranch hand's eye and declared him healthy and loud and a good size. "He has got the Merritt jaw," Pete said. "He has got Clyde's eyes," Kate said. "He has got both, and that is the best possible outcome," Pete said, with the authority of a man who has no children but strong opinions. And then he sat down in the corner chair and stayed for 2 hours and talked to the baby in a low voice about cattle, which the baby apparently found soothing. The years moved then the way good years move, which is not slowly or quickly, but at exactly the right pace, full and varied and alive. Frank grew into a boy who was his mother's son in his stubbornness and his love of the land, and his father's son in his hands, which were precise and capable, and seemed to know naturally how things were made. By the time he could walk steadily, he was following Clyde into the workshop, and by the time he was 4, he could identify every tool by name and knew what each one was for. Kate expanded the herd steadily, back toward the 400 her father had kept and then past it, carefully and without overextending. The land supported it. The creek access she had fought to keep made the difference in the dry years, 1881 being particularly dry, when neighboring ranchers were hauling water and Kate's cattle were still watering at the western creek with no particular difficulty. Clyde's reputation as a builder continued to grow, and by 1882 he had more work offered than he could take in a year, which was a good problem to have. He turned down the work that would take him too far from the ranch for too long and took the work that could be done in a day's or week's ride, and the income it brought in added to the financial stability of the operation in ways that Kate appreciated enormously. The well needed replacing properly in 1882, the old stone casing finally giving way, and Clyde rebuilt it with good brick and a new pump mechanism, and a cover structure that kept the groundwater clean. And she stood at the new well on the morning after it was finished and pumped the handle and watched the clean cold water come up from the ground, and thought about all the things that had been fixed, and all the things that had been built, and all the things that were now solid that had once been at risk of falling. She had run out of ways to hold it together once. She did not let herself forget that, because it kept her honest about what she had and what it had taken to keep it. On a September evening in 1882, 4 years after a man with a mule load of tools had ridden up her wagon road and asked where she wanted to start, Kate and Clyde sat on the porch of the farmhouse as the sun went down behind the western ridge and painted the sky in the colors that New Mexico does better than anywhere else on earth. All that deep orange and rose and purple spread out above the mountains like something extravagant and free. Frank was inside with Pete, who at 67 was slower in his limbs but entirely unchanged in his opinions, and they could hear Pete's voice and the boy's voice in the warm interior of the house, some ongoing negotiation about something involving Pete's hat, which Frank had always coveted. Kate was sitting in her white oak rocking chair, which Clyde had carried out to the porch because the evening was too good to waste inside. She was 4 months along with their second child, and she felt it in the weight of herself, not unpleasantly, just as a fact of things. Clyde was sitting on the porch step, his back against the post, one knee up, looking at the sunset with the easy attention of a man who has learned to actually receive the things the world offers him. "What are you thinking about?" Kate asked. He considered. "The porch needs new boards in the spring," he said. "2 of them are going soft." She laughed. "That is what you are thinking about while looking at that sky." He tilted his head up and looked at it again, considering. "I am also thinking," he said, "that I am the luckiest man in the New Mexico Territory." "You are the best carpenter in the New Mexico Territory," she said. "I cannot speak to the luck." "I rode up a road with my tools and knocked on your gate," he said. "That is luck if anything is." "I was on the roof," she said. "You could have ridden up and found nothing." "I would have waited," he said. She looked at the side of his face, the familiar jaw, the gray eyes on the colors of the evening. "You had not even met me," she said. "No," he said, "but Holly's Prout told me enough." He paused. "He said there was a woman out this road who was fighting to keep something real and was nearly out of ways to do it alone and deserved someone who would ask her what she needed and then actually do it. I thought I might be that person." Kate was quiet for a moment. The sunset was enormous above the mountains. Below them, the south barn stood solid in the evening light, and the fence lines ran true to the horizon, and the cattle were moving in the pasture with the slow, unhurried motion of animals at peace, and the house behind her was level at its corners and the well was clean. "You were that person," she said. He turned and looked at her, and the warmth in his face was the same warmth she had seen in it that first week, that first dinner at the Las Vegas hotel, that February evening in the kitchen when he asked her to marry him, all the same warmth, unchanged and deepening. "So were you," he said. She reached over and put her hand in his where it lay on the porch step, and he turned his hand and held hers, and they were quiet together in the enormous evening light of the New Mexico sky, the sound of Pete and Frank coming from inside the house, the cattle moving, the wind through the grass, the whole solid living world of everything they had built and kept and loved. Inside, Pete declared victory in the negotiation over his hat, which Frank disputed loudly and with considerable legal argument for a 4-year-old. Kate smiled at the sound of it and leaned her head back in her chair and looked at the last of the colors as they deepened toward dark, and she thought about the barn that had fallen and the lien that had come, and the money she had driven 4 days to earn, and the man who had ridden up with his tools and asked where she wanted to start. And she thought that the story of a life was mostly about what you chose to hold on to and who you chose to hold it with. And that she had held onto the right things and chosen the right person, and there was nothing in the world, she was quite certain, that she would change. Their second child, a boy they named Thomas, was born in February of 1883, and he came into the world quieter than Frank, but with the same dark hair and the same look of someone who intended to understand everything around him before committing to any opinions. Frank was fascinated by him in the wary way of a firstborn who is not entirely sure about this development, and Pete declared him a fine baby in a tone that suggested he had been expecting nothing less. Clyde held Thomas on the first morning and talked to him the same way he had talked to Frank, which was directly and honestly, telling him about the land and the ranch and the things that had been built on it, and the things that would be built. Kate watched him from the bed, her coffee in both hands, and felt the same undone feeling she always felt watching him with their children, the way the steady, capable hands that knew how to frame a barn and set a foundation held a newborn with such careful, certain gentleness. "You are going to have to rebuild the bunkhouse eventually," Kate said, "if Pete keeps threatening to move out every time I hire seasonal help." "Pete is not going anywhere," Clyde said, not looking up from the baby. "No," Kate agreed. "He is not." Pete, when consulted on the subject, said that he would decide when he was going and where, "Thank you very much," and that for the present he was perfectly comfortable, and that someone needed to stay and make sure the Yates children were being raised with proper information about cattle, which clearly their father was inadequate to provide. "I know a fair amount about cattle," Clyde said. "You know about wood," Pete said with dignity. "That is different." This argument had been going on in various forms for 5 years and showed no signs of resolution, which suited everyone fine. By 1884, the Merritt Ranch, which was now as often called the Yates Ranch, though Kate kept both names on the deed with a fierce attachment to her father's part in it, had 460 head of cattle and was considered one of the better-run operations in the Harlow area. The land was sound and the water rights were secure and the buildings were solid, and on any given morning you could stand in the yard and look out at the pastures and the mountains and the enormous New Mexico sky, and know that this was a place that would be here long after the people standing in it were gone, which was the best thing that could be said of a piece of land. Kate still fixed things herself when she could. She still knew every inch of the land by heart. She still negotiated her own cattle prices and kept her own books and made her own decisions about the herd, and Clyde had never once suggested she do otherwise. He had built this life alongside her, not in front of her or behind her or in spite of her, but alongside, which was the only arrangement that had ever made any sense to her. One morning in the late spring of 1884, she rode out to the south pasture fence line for a routine inspection, something she still did herself every few weeks, and she found a section of wire down where the previous winter's frost heave had pushed a post out of line. She got down from her horse and looked at it and knew exactly what to do and what tools she needed, and she rode back to the ranch and got them. Clyde saw her saddling back up with the tools and came over. "South fence," he said. "Post heaved," she said. "One section down. I can ride out with you," she considered. The morning was clear and fine and the land was beautiful in the May light, and Frank was in school in Harlow and Thomas was with Pete and the day was all in front of them. "Come on then," she said. They rode out together across the pasture in the spring morning, the two of them on their horses with the tools between them, and the land ran out on all sides to the mountains and the sky, and the cattle grazed in the distance, and everything was as it should be. They reset the post together and restrung the wire and tightened it true, and when it was done Kate stepped back and looked at it, and it was good solid work as it always was, because they had learned from each other and they had been doing this together long enough to know how. "Good," she said. "Good," he agreed. She turned and looked at him in the morning light, this man who had ridden up her road with his tools and his steady eyes, and asked where she wanted to start. And she loved him in the full and rooted way you love someone who has been part of your real life. Not the easy parts but the actual parts, the cold mornings and the difficult work and the fear and the recovery from fear, all of it, and who has loved you back through all of it with the same steadiness they brought to everything. "Ready to head back?" he asked. "In a minute," she said. She put her hand on the fence post, solid in the New Mexico ground, feeling the warmth the sun had already put into the wood and the wire, and she looked out across the pasture at the cattle and the grass and the ridge of mountains in the distance and the endlessly generous sky, and she breathed in the smell of spring and soil and everything alive. This was hers, theirs, built and repaired and held and loved and alive. "All right," she said. "Let us go home." They rode back across the pasture side by side in the morning light, and the land ran on and on to the mountains, and everything was as it should be.